20,000 years ago, the world was cold enough to kill. The story of how we Homo sapiens survived the last ice age doesn't begin with triumph. It begins with fear. Not the kind of fear we know today, deadlines, wars, or screens glowing in the dark, but the raw, ancient fear of hunger, of endless winter, of vanishing light. Around 26,000 years ago, the Earth stood on the brink of its coldest chapter in the last 100,000 years. Scientists call it the last glacial maximum, the point when the planet's ice sheets reached their fullest extent. And in that age of extremes, survival itself became a question of adaptation or extinction. The planet was colder by about 4 to 8 degrees Celsius on average, but those numbers don't tell the whole story. Across the northern continents, glaciers towered higher than skyscrapers. They buried Canada beneath 2 kilometers of ice, swallowed Scandinavia, and reached down through Britain, Germany, and parts of the northern United States. Sea levels fell by more than 120 meters, exposing vast tracts of land that are now hidden under the ocean. What we know today as the English Channel, the Bering Strait, and the South China Sea were dry plains. New lands emerged, bridges of possibility and peril. Across the equator, monsoons weakened. Tropical forests shrank. Deserts stretched wider. The world's climate belts were torn and shifted. Only the resilient and the clever could endure. For most living creatures, the Ice Age was a prison. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant deer followed shrinking grasslands south. Entire species vanished. Even the great predators, saber-toothed cats and cave lions, found themselves starving as prey declined. And the humans who walked this frozen earth. They, too, faced near extinction. Homo neanderthalensis. Our stocky cousins had already retreated into pockets of southern Europe. Their numbers dwindled. Small, isolated, cut off from one another. When the cold grew harsher, their world collapsed. Meanwhile, our species Homo sapiens had begun to move north from Africa tens of thousands of years earlier, following rivers, coastlines, and herds. But as the glaciers advanced, those same lands turned to tundra. The very limits of human endurance were tested. Imagine standing on the steppes of Ice Age Europe. The sky is a pale gray bruise. The wind cuts through layers of fur and skin. Every breath feels like glass in your lungs. There are no forests, only a sea of frozen grass waving in the wind. Herds of mammoth, bison, and horse drift like moving shadows across the plains. And scattered among them, tiny clusters of humans, maybe 20, maybe 30. Each family group fighting to stay alive. At this latitude, winter lasts 9 months. The sun never climbs high. Night can swallow the world for days. Every decision is life or death. Where to camp? When to move? Who goes hunting? Who stays behind to tend the fire? Because in this world, even the smallest mistake, a broken tool, a missed shot, a forgotten ember, can end an entire bloodline. What makes an ice age deadly isn't just the temperature. It's the instability. Glaciologists studying ancient ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have found that climate during the last ice age wasn't a smooth freeze. It was chaos. Temperatures rose and fell abruptly, sometimes by 5 to 10 degrees within mere decades, triggering droughts, floods, and sudden storms. One moment, reindeer roamed across a grassy steppe. A century later, that same steppe was buried under meters of snow. For early humans, such volatility demanded more than endurance. It demanded imagination. You couldn't simply wait for the season to change. You had to anticipate it. You had to plan for a world that might never be the same twice. And that's where Homo sapiens began to pull ahead. Somewhere on those plains, under a sky filled with auroras and ice dust, a child crouches by a fire. He watches his mother feed sticks into the flames, the sparks dancing upward like stars. The warmth touches his face, and for a brief moment, he feels safe. That fire, simple as it seems, was humanity's oldest ally. Archaeologists have found ancient hearths across Ice Age sites. their layers of charcoal still blackened after 30,000 years. Fire meant heat, light, protection, and the power to cook meat, unlocking more calories from every bite. But fire also meant control, the first small victory against chaos. Every flickering flame was a declaration. We will not be ruled by the cold. Ironically, the Ice Age was both a curse and a catalyst. When glaciers carved the land, they also sculpted new environments. They ground down mountains, formed fertile valleys, and created vast plains filled with grazing animals. And as the sea level dropped, land bridges connected continents that had once been isolated. One such bridge, the Bering Land Bridge, joined Siberia to Alaska, opening the door to the Americas. Another, across what's now the South China Sea, linked the islands of Southeast Asia into a single landmass, the Sunda Shelf. Humans could now walk from Vietnam to Borneo without ever seeing an ocean. The Ice Age, in all its cruelty, also expanded humanity's stage. But only those who could adapt to its rules would get to play upon it. Around this time, between 40,000 and 25,000 years ago, there were still several kinds of humans left on Earth. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the mountains of Siberia, and us, the Sapiens, spreading across Africa, Asia, and beyond. Each faced the same freezing world. But each responded differently. Neanderthals relied on brute strength and close-quarters hunting, ambushing prey in forests that were now vanishing. Their tools, though sophisticated, changed little over thousands of years. Sapiens, on the other hand, began experimenting. They refined projectile points to strike from a distance, crafted needles from bone, and layered fur garments to trap warmth. They built shelters from mammoth bones and hides, some so large and symmetrical that modern architects still marvel at their efficiency. The ice didn't make us, it filtered us. Only those who could think ahead, who could imagine something that didn't yet exist, would endure. Archaeological data shows that around 19,000 years ago, human population in Europe was at one of its lowest points in prehistory. Some estimates suggest that fewer than 5,000 individuals may have survived in scattered refuges south of the ice sheets. Entire genetic lineages vanished. Others merged through interbreeding. The Ice Age squeezed humanity through a genetic bottleneck. But what emerged on the other side was us. Every person alive today is descended from those few who endured that unimaginable winter. We carry their victories in our blood, and their fears in our bones. Picture Europe not as one continent but as an archipelago of life surrounded by death. Southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, pockets of Italy and the Black Sea coast. These were refugee islands of warmth in a frozen world. There, small human groups clung to survival, foraging, hunting, crafting, and teaching their children the secrets of staying alive. They passed down not just tools, but knowledge, how to recognize the tracks of migrating herds, how to preserve meat in the snow, how to stitch hides so tightly that no wind could pass through. Culture itself became a survival mechanism. If you could look up at that sky 25,000 years ago, you would see the same stars we do today, but sharper, colder, clearer. Without pollution, without city light, the Milky Way was a river of frost flowing overhead. And maybe, in that darkness, those early humans began to wonder. The first stories were likely born beside those fires. Not stories of gods or empires, but of endurance. How to hunt the mammoth, how to find the hidden valley where the wind breaks, how to remember the path back home. The Ice Age taught us more than survival, it taught us memory. To endure the cold, the human body had to change its habits, not its bones. We didn't grow fur or thick fat like a mammoth. Instead, we learned to build fur, to burn fuel, to store knowledge. Metabolic studies suggest Ice Age humans consumed up to 4,000 to 5,000 calories per day, double a modern adult's intake, just to keep warm. Every decision about hunting, food, and fire was about energy management. Where nature failed to equip us, culture filled the gap. The Ice Age wasn't one frozen block of time, it pulsed. Cycles of freezing and melting, lasting thousands of years, reshaped coastlines and ecosystems. Geologists call them Dansgaard-Oshgar, events, abrupt climate swings visible in ice core layers like rings in a tree. Each fluctuation meant crisis. Each crisis demanded innovation. It's in these times that we see the birth of new technologies: microlithic blades, compound tools, decorated clothing, even early musical instruments made from bird bones. Every innovation was a whisper of defiance against extinction. From the Russian plains to the caves of southern France, archaeologists have uncovered engravings, carvings, and painted scenes dating to this very period. They show bison, horses, mammoths, sometimes drawn with remarkable precision. What's striking isn't just the beauty, but the pattern. These images cluster in places that were safe during the coldest centuries. Art became a marker of resilience, a sign that wherever creativity survived, so did life. When we look back now, it's tempting to see inevitability, to think we were destined to survive because we were smarter or better. But the fossil record doesn't say that. It tells a humbler story. We nearly vanished. We were fragile, scattered, dependent on chance. The difference wasn't destiny, it was adaptability. We could move, share, and change faster than the world could freeze us. That, more than any tool or gene, was the secret of survival. As the glaciers began their slow retreat around 20,000 years ago, rivers thawed, plains reopened, and herds multiplied again. For the first time in millennia, humanity could breathe. But that breathing space came with a cost. The world they stepped into was not the one their ancestors had known. Coastlines were different. Habitats had shifted. Entire species were gone. And so began the next chapter, not of endurance, but of expansion. The Ice Age had tested the species to its limits. Now it would reveal what humanity had become. The cold was relentless. It did not strike like a storm. It lingered like a memory that refused to fade. After thousands of years of retreat and adaptation, small bands of humans now stood face to face with the Ice Age in its full strength. There was no turning back. Only one question remained: could intelligence replace instinct? Because the only species that would survive this frozen world were the ones who learned not just to endure nature, but to shape it. Long before language, before art or belief, there was fire. For our ancestors, fire was not just light. It was security. It was control. A single spark separated the living from the dead. Without it, the ice devoured everything. Across the plains of Europe, in places like Dolní Věstonice in today's Czech Republic, hearths have been found blackened by smoke that rose 30,000 years ago. Ash, charcoal, and bone mixed together in circular dwellings, each one a fragile heartbeat of life in an endless winter. Fire changed the rules. It dried hides, hardened spear points, cooked meat to release every possible calorie, and kept predators at bay. At night, when the wind howled across the tundra, the fire became the center of the universe, a small sun burning in defiance of the cold. It was the first time humanity didn't just suffer the world, it commanded it. But flames alone were not enough. You couldn't carry a hearth on a hunt, nor chase mammoths with burning logs in hand. To survive the cold, people needed warmth they could wear. And so they invented it. In the frozen valleys of Siberia, archaeologists have unearthed bone needles, polished smooth, with tiny eyes drilled for thread, some over 40,000 years old. They were the world's first sewing tools. Threaded with sinew, they joined hides and furs into layered garments that trapped warm air close to the skin. These weren't crude wraps. They were tailored survival. The birth of clothing as technology. Even genetics tells the same story. Biologists studying lice discovered that clothing lice evolved separately from head lice about 170,000 years ago. Proof that long before the ice reached its height, humans were already wrapped in crafted warmth. Where evolution gave us only bare skin, ingenuity gave us armor. In the endless white, where trees were scarce and stone was brittle, humans built with what the ice provided, bone. Across what is now Ukraine and Russia, archaeologists discovered the remains of circular dwellings built entirely from the bones of mammoths, jawbones forming walls, tusks bent into arches, skulls stacked as windbreaks. Over these frames, hides were stretched and sealed with animal fat to keep out the wind. Fires burned inside. Smoke rose through small holes cut in the roof, leaving black halos on the bone. At Mizarek, one such home still stands in fragments, its ivory walls arranged with symmetry and intention. It's not the work of desperation, it's the work of design. Even amid starvation, humans built comfort. Every rib of bone was a defiance carved into the ice. The Ice Age did not only reshape the land, it reshaped the human mind. In the archaeological record, between 35,000 and 15,000 years ago, we see a sudden diversification of tools. Humans began crafting microblades, thin, razor-sharp flakes of flint that could be embedded into wooden or bone shafts. Each one was a fragment of a greater whole, forming knives, arrows, and spears light enough to travel far and fast. The invention of these composite weapons transformed hunting forever. They required planning, fine motor skill, and foresight, qualities that separated Homo sapiens from every other creature walking the earth. It was a quiet revolution, not louder weapons, but smarter ones. Imagine it, a vast plain under a sun that gives no warmth, the air so cold that breath crystallizes before it falls. A herd of mammoths trudges across the snow, massive shadows against the horizon. From a ridge nearby, humans move in silence. They have studied the herd for days, the wind, the terrain, the pattern of movement. Their weapons are ready, long spears tipped with stone, arrows fletched with feathers, ropes woven from sinew. At a signal, the group fans out, surrounding the herd. The wind carries their scent away. One mammoth stumbles. Spears flash. The earth shakes with its final cry. For a moment, the cold is forgotten. There is food, fat, fur, and bone enough to feed and clothe dozens for weeks. Nothing is wasted. Every tendon, every tusk, becomes material for tools, for shelter, for art. In the Ice Age, death itself was recycled into life. Modern humans live on about 2,000 calories a day. In the Ice Age, survival required twice that, even at rest. Every breath in the cold demanded more energy. Every heartbeat had to burn faster just to stay warm. This forced our ancestors to become the most efficient foragers and hunters the planet had ever seen. They diversified their diets: mammoth when possible, fish when necessary, small game when desperate. They dug roots from frozen ground, crushed bones for marrow, and used snow as a primitive refrigerator to preserve meat. When big game hunts failed, they survived by flexibility. This is what anthropologists call a broad-spectrum adaptation. In a changing world, variety meant resilience. The secret to survival wasn't strength. It was range. Among the frozen dwellings of Central Europe, archaeologists at Dolny Vastanis found something remarkable. Tiny sculptures shaped from clay, then fired in open hearths. They are among the oldest ceramics ever discovered, 29,000 years old. Some represent animals, mammoths, lions, bears. Others, human forms, full-bodied women with exaggerated hips and breasts, symbols of fertility, abundance, or continuity. While the ice devoured forests and beasts, humans created images of life. To make art in a dying world was itself an act of survival, a reminder that meaning could outlast hunger. Their fires no longer only cooked meat. They baked imagination. The further humans spread, the more they relied on one another. In small groups of perhaps 20 to 40 individuals, the hearth became the nucleus of social life, the first true community. Children learned by watching, imitating, playing. Elders carried the group's memory: where to find obsidian, how to follow the stars, how to predict the return of herds. Knowledge became as vital as food. And language, though invisible in the archaeological record, must have been its vessel. To hunt in unison, to teach sewing, to pass myths and rules, they needed words. And those words gave form to thought, turned experience into strategy, and memory into legacy. Language wasn't invented for poetry. It was invented to stay alive. In northeastern Siberia, where the winter sun barely rises, archaeologists discovered a place known as the Yana rhinoceros horn site, a frozen time capsule from 32,000 years ago. Here, above the Arctic Circle, humans lived in temperatures that dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. They made tools from mammoth ivory, decorated beads with geometric carvings, and crafted spear points polished to a mirror sheen. To survive in such a place was almost impossible. But they did. They dug semi-subterranean houses insulated with moss and fur. They stored meat in frozen pits, an early form of refrigeration. They hunted reindeer that migrated across the tundra, following them through the seasons. These people were not victims of the cold, they were its architects. They learned to use the ice. Even without writing, mathematics, or blueprints, humans of this age thought like engineers. They calculated weight, leverage, and balance intuitively. They understood aerodynamics long before the word existed. The bow and arrow, emerging roughly 20,000 years ago, was a masterpiece of physics and precision. It transformed distance into safety. It turned one hunter into many. Such inventions did more than feed. They rewired the human brain for problem solving. Every knot tied, every structure built, every weapon shaped, was an exercise in abstract thinking, the same kind that would later lead to science, to architecture, to civilization itself. Technology alone cannot sustain a species. For that, you need connection. In the Ice Age, culture was technology. Stories encoded survival lessons. Songs preserved roots and seasons. Symbols on cave walls, spirals, dots, hands, carried information across generations. The act of storytelling around fire may have been our greatest adaptation. It united the tribe, healed fear, and gave purpose to endurance. When everything froze, words kept moving. In the end, that was our true invention. A shared mind stretched across many bodies. Slowly, imperceptibly, the glaciers began to retreat. The great white walls that had defined the horizon started to melt back into rivers and valleys. The world thawed, but humanity did not return to what it had been. The cold had changed us. We had learned to build homes instead of nests, to make warmth instead of seeking it, to imagine tools before shaping them, to plan seasons ahead instead of waiting for fate. The Ice Age had tested our limits. In surviving it, we discovered our identity. We were no longer just creatures of flesh and bone. We had become creatures of design, and from the tools we made came everything that followed. Art, science, architecture, civilization, all of it began here. When a few fragile humans faced a frozen world and refused to die. We learned to make warmth from nothing. We learned to make meaning from survival. And in doing so, we became human. The cold began to ease, but the world it left behind was unrecognizable. Glaciers withdrew like slow ghosts, revealing valleys carved by ice and rivers running for the first time in centuries. The air softened, and the sun touched the land with a warmth that must have felt almost supernatural. Humanity had survived. But survival was no longer enough. Something deeper had begun to stir within us, something invisible, yet far more powerful than any tool we had ever forged. We had learned to hunt, to build, to make fire. Now, we would learn to think in symbols. We would begin to dream. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain had grown slowly, a quiet evolution hidden inside the skull. By around 70,000 years ago, a subtle change had occurred. Connections between the frontal and temporal lobes had thickened, allowing abstract thought, imagination, and planning. Scientists call this the cognitive revolution, but perhaps it was something even greater. The moment when the world inside the mind became as real as the one outside. In that new landscape of thought, humans began to ask impossible questions. What lies beyond the hills? Where do the animals go when they die? What happens when the fire burns out? It was curiosity turned inward, a consciousness aware of itself. To share that inner world, we needed sound, not just calls or cries, but meaning. No fossil can record a word. Yet language left traces everywhere, in art, in social coordination, in the complexity of tools. The very existence of large, organized hunts suggests the presence of structured communication, and genetic studies show that the FOXP2 gene critical for speech and grammar had already been present in humans and even Neanderthals more than 400,000 years ago. But somewhere along the way, we did something new. We began to link words into stories. A single word, mammoth, could mean prey, warmth, survival, and myth. A phrase could warn, inspire, or teach. Through language, knowledge no longer had to die with its speaker. Language allowed memory to outlive flesh. It was the first true form of immortality. Once humans could imagine and communicate, they began to leave their thoughts behind, not in speech, but in matter. Stone, pigment, bone, and ivory became vessels for the invisible. Deep in the caves of southern France, the walls still glow with their touch. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. Each a cathedral carved by firelight. In Chauvet, dating to around 36,000 years ago, horses gallop across limestone walls, their bodies painted in ochre and charcoal, their legs blurred to suggest motion. The first attempt at animation in human history. At Lascaux, the artists mixed minerals, spat pigment through hollow bones, and painted by torchlight more than 17,000 years ago. They drew herds, hunts, and the cycles of the moon, but also handprints, scattered across stone like echoes of identity. These weren't decorations. They were memories made visible. A way of saying, we were here. Why paint, when every calorie counted? Why carve animals on walls no one would ever see again? Because imagination had become a survival trait. Symbols gave form to thought. Thought gave cohesion to people. When a group shared an image, they shared belief. And belief, even in something unseen, could unite strangers under the same purpose. This, anthropologists say, was the true engine of human civilization. The ability to build shared fictions. Not lies, but meanings, stories that organized behavior long before law or writing existed. A painted horse was not just a horse. It was a promise. A prayer for tomorrow. Far from Europe, in Indonesia's Sulawesi caves, a red outline of a hand dated to at least 40,000 years ago shows that the language of art was global. In Africa, the engraved ochre blocks of Blombos Cave carry geometric patterns over 70,000 years old. In each place, the same impulse flickered: to make the unseen visible. Music, too, joined this chorus. In the Swabian Jura of Germany, flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory, some 35,000 years old, have been found. Their tones, when reconstructed, are haunting, delicate, deliberate, human. To play them required both breath and rhythm, a heart keeping time with thought. Imagine that sound rising into the darkness of a cave, echoing against stone, while firelight trembles on the walls. The first concert in human history wasn't entertainment. It was connection. It turned sound into belonging. Every symbol, every song, every painting demanded the same neurological miracle: a brain that could separate imagination from reality and still choose to believe. Neuroscientists studying this capacity call it theory of mind, the ability to imagine what others think, feel, or know. Its empathy turned into prediction. And it changed everything. To survive in groups, you had to understand more than behavior. You had to anticipate emotions, intentions, betrayals. This invisible map of other minds became the foundation of trust, the social glue of humanity. The Ice Age didn't just forge our bodies. It sculpted our empathy. When the wind screamed outside and night seemed endless, humans told stories around the fire. They weren't myths then, they were lessons. How to track a herd. When the rivers freeze. Which stars point home. Knowledge carried in rhythm and repetition. So a child could remember even when the teacher was gone. But within those stories hid something more. Tales of spirits, ancestors, and unseen powers reflected the dawning of spirituality. The belief that life extended beyond death, that meaning outlasted the body. The earliest evidence of such faith appears in burials from Sanjir, Russia. Graves dating back more than 30,000 years, filled with beads, ivory spears, and red ochre. Children and adults alike were laid carefully, as if prepared for another world. The ice had taught them loss. Belief taught them hope. As communities grew, so did complexity. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups note that maintaining trust and memory across 20 or more individuals requires higher cognitive processing, what scientists call the social brain hypothesis. Our ancestors' expanded neocortex allowed them to remember hundreds of faces, track alliances, obligations, and reputations. To keep groups cohesive, they developed rituals, dances, songs, shared meals, all forms of synchrony that neurologically reinforced unity. When they danced together, their hearts literally beat in rhythm. And rhythm kept them alive. Every drumbeat in prehistory was a heartbeat amplified. Even mathematics was born in that age, long before writing. In Africa's Labumbo and Ishango bones, dated between 40,000 and 20,000 years ago, archaeologists found tally marks etched in sequence, perhaps tracking lunar cycles or hunting counts. Each line was a thought externalized, the beginning of data. We were learning not just to imagine but to record. Not just to feel but to measure. From rhythm to numbers, from pigment to prayer, the human mind was expanding its frontiers, and the frontier was now internal. By the end of the Ice Age, our species had become something unprecedented, a creature whose survival depended not on its strength, but on its stories. We had learned to turn fear into ritual, hunger into art, loss into language. Every emotion became a tool, every dream, a map. The same imagination that painted walls and carved flutes would, millennia later, build pyramids and satellites. It was the same brain, only given more time and more canvas. The ice had forced us to think beyond instinct. And once imagination awoke, it never went back to sleep. It's easy to think of survival as logic, calories, temperature, numbers. But when everything froze, it wasn't logic that kept people alive. It was love. Love for a child's breath in the cold. Love for a friend's voice in the dark. Love for a story that promised tomorrow. These emotions, wired deep into our nervous system, were not weaknesses, they were adaptations. They made us care enough to cooperate, to protect, to remember, to imagine a future worth living in. The mind that adapted was not just rational, it was emotional. And that combination, thought fused with feeling, was the most powerful invention of all. As the glaciers melted and forests returned, humans carried with them more than tools or fire. They carried culture, invisible, transmissible, immortal. The stories painted on cave walls became memories passed through generations. The melodies played on ivory flutes became echoes in the DNA of our music today. And the empathy that bound a few families around a fire would one day bind civilizations across continents. The Ice Age had created a paradox. A world stripped of comfort gave birth to the most complex comfort of all. The mind capable of imagining warmth, even in the coldest night. That imagination, once kindled, would light every age that followed. We were shaped by ice, but defined by imagination. And when the world grew silent, it was our minds that began to sing. The mind had awakened. Humans could dream, paint, and pray, but the ice still ruled the earth. And even imagination needed a body to survive. Every breath of that frozen air tested not only thought, but blood. Long before the last glaciers reached their peak, humanity had already mingled with others. We were not alone, and we never truly were. Across the ancient world, other humans had thrived before us. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in the mountains of Siberia, and perhaps still others whose bones are gone but whose genes remain. When modern humans spread from Africa around 60,000 years ago, we met them, and sometimes, we merged. The encounters were brief, scattered, and intimate. But from those moments came an inheritance that still flows in our veins. Today, every non-African human carries about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, and some people in Asia and Oceania carry up to 5% Denisovan ancestry. Fragments of ancient bloodline folded quietly into our own. What the ice separated, evolution stitched together. For years, scientists wondered whether that ancient genetic blending was simply accidental, a trace of ancient contact with no real consequence. But the genome tells another story. Some of the borrowed genes were gifts of survival. They involved skin and hair keratin, which affects how our bodies respond to cold and sunlight. Others helped fine-tune the immune system, preparing us for foreign pathogens and new lands. Still others shaped fat metabolism, enabling our ancestors to store heat more efficiently in freezing environments. Among the most famous of these adaptations is the EPase-1 gene, found in modern populations of Tibet and the Himalayas. It allows the blood to carry oxygen more efficiently at high altitudes, reducing fatigue and risk of hypoxia. That gene's ancestry traces not to Homo sapiens, but to Denisovans, the mysterious cousins who vanished 40,000 years ago. Their bodies disappeared, but their resilience lived on. In us, not all inheritances were blessings. Some Neanderthal variants, once useful, now cause trouble in the modern world. Greater risk of inflammation, tendencies toward nicotine addiction, and altered immune responses linked to allergies. Evolution does not predict the future. It only rewards what works now. In a frozen world filled with wounds and disease, a hyper-reactive immune system could mean survival. In today's world of abundance, it can mean autoimmune illness. Every adaptation has its echo, and the echoes of the ice still whisper through our cells. Our species' story is written not only in DNA, but in bone. The people who walked the mammoth steppe were shorter, stockier, with wider rib cages and thicker limbs, a shape that conserved heat. In contrast, their ancestors from tropical Africa were taller, leaner, built to shed it. This pattern, known as Bergmann's and Allen's rules, shows how climate sculpts the body. Cold compresses, heat elongates. Over generations, form follows temperature. But even as the body changed, the brain remained the same. The same neurons that once plotted hunts now dreamed of constellations. The same hands that scraped hides began to carve ivory. Adaptation did not only preserve us, it refined us. To live through months of darkness required more than muscle. It required a metabolism tuned to scarcity. The Ice Age diet was high in protein and fat: mammoth, reindeer, fish, marrow. To process it, humans evolved enzymes like AMY1 for breaking down starch, and FADs for converting fatty acids into brain fuel. Those with more copies of these genes could better survive famine and cold. Inside every cell, mitochondria, the body's furnaces, had to work overtime. The people of the Ice Age literally burned hotter. Even their blood adapted, iron storage shifted, hemoglobin adjusted, and subtle genetic variations fine-tuned how oxygen bound to red cells. Each winter rewrote us slightly. Generation by generation, the cold selected its survivors. For centuries after Neanderthals vanished, their traces lay dormant, locked in our genome like faint memories. Only recently did science learn how to read them. By extracting DNA from ancient bones, a fragment from a finger in Denisova Cave, a piece of skull from Vindaja, a tooth from El Citron, geneticists rebuilt the lost family tree of humankind. And in doing so, they found something humbling. We are not pure. We are not singular. We are the sum of unions and extinctions. The borders between species, once thought sharp, blur like footprints in melting snow. Every human alive today carries proof that survival was never solitary. It was shared. As ice ruled the land, hormones ruled the body. The stress of cold, hunger, and danger shaped our internal chemistry. Levels of cortisol and adrenaline rose. Metabolism quickened. The body's entire hormonal system evolved to respond to extremes. Even our sleep changed. In prolonged winter darkness, the pineal gland produced more melatonin, modulating circadian rhythms to fit endless night. To this day, people living in high latitudes show genetic variants that regulate sleep and mood differently, remnants of adaptation to the long, dim winters of prehistory. When we feel seasonal melancholy, we're hearing echoes of ancient winters in our blood. Skin color, too, carries the signature of the ice. As our ancestors moved north, the thick melanin shield that once protected them from tropical sun became a disadvantage. In the dim skies of Europe and Asia, they needed to absorb more ultraviolet light to produce vitamin D, essential for bones and immunity. Gradually, over millennia, their skin lightened, not as a mark of identity, but as an adjustment to physics. Light and dark, cold and heat, the body balanced between them like a living equation. Evolution is not moral. It is mathematical. Every tone of skin, every curl of hair, every breath of mountain air, is a compromise between environment and endurance. Genetics did not only shape our bodies, it also influenced our minds. Some Neanderthal DNA fragments are active in brain tissue today, modulating circadian rhythms, emotions, and cognitive processing. Perhaps they gave early humans a sharper memory of landscapes, a deeper sensitivity to weather, or a quieter temperament suited to long winters. These are not separate gifts from extinct cousins. They are pieces of the same puzzle, reforged together. The Ice Age was not a wall-dividing species. It was a crucible mixing them. When we look at the genome today, we see not a straight line, but a network. Threads of ancestry tangled across continents. A small tribe of hunter-gatherers in Siberia carried both Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, and their descendants spread east into the Americas. In Southeast Asia, others interbred with Denisovans, whose genetic signatures differ from those in the Himalayas. Each encounter left traces, faint but enduring. We tend to think of human history as a tree. It was more like a river delta, many channels merging, diverging, and merging again, until only one great current remained. That current is us. To endure cold is to master energy. The body's response to frost, shivering, blood vessel constriction, fat storage, is ancient. But humans learned to amplify it with mind and culture. Clothing, shelter, and fire reduced physical pressure, allowing genes for creativity to thrive where brute strength once ruled. Those who could imagine better tools or read the sky for weather outlived those who could not. The ice rewarded not power, but pattern recognition. Even our stress responses, anxiety, vigilance, planning, are relics of that time. To worry was to survive. The descendants of the cautious inherited the earth. When scientists sequenced more ancient genomes, they found that some individuals living only 5,000 years ago still carried Denisovan alleles, while others in Europe had remnants of Neanderthal variants long after those species disappeared. We did not replace them overnight. We absorbed them. And what emerged was not a pure species, but a mosaic, a collage of adaptations, intuitions, and memories written in code. Our diversity today, in form, color, metabolism, and thought, is the biological echo of that mosaic. Each of us carries different fragments of the Ice Age in our DNA, like shards of a mirror reflecting an ancient world. DNA is memory, written in chemistry. Every replication of a cell is a whisper of ancestry. Within the nucleus, sequences that once belonged to Neanderthals and Denisovans still switch on and off, guiding proteins, tuning immunity, shaping how we breathe, sleep, and heal. The Ice Age didn't just carve valleys into the land. It carved instructions into life itself. When we climb a mountain and feel breathless, when we crave warmth, when we wake earlier in winter, we are replaying ancient code. We are living fossils, animated by memory. As humanity began to thrive again, the memory of the cold transformed into story. Myths of giants, spirits of the mountains, gods of frost and fire. Perhaps these were echoes of the beings we once met and mingled with. The Neanderthals became the giants of legend. The Denisovans, the spirits of the highlands. Their faces disappeared, but their essence remained, transformed into mythologies that outlasted even glaciers. Science, millennia later, would uncover the same truth through molecules. Those myths were not entirely wrong. We truly are made of others. The Ice Age ended around 11,700 years ago, but its fingerprints remain everywhere in genomes, bones, and the architecture of our minds. The blood that once learned to endure darkness now fuels cities of light. The genes that once guarded against famine now wrestle with abundance. The instincts that once kept us alive now make us restless. Every comfort we build is a negotiation with that ancient past. We are still creatures of the cold, dreaming of warmth. When we look into a fire today, the reflection flickers the same way it did 50,000 years ago. Behind the glow lies a truth our ancestors knew instinctively, that survival is not isolation, but inheritance. Our blood is not pure, it is shared. It carries the voices of the vanished, those who walked beside us through snow, those who gave us pieces of themselves so we could live. And every heartbeat, every breath drawn in cold air, is a quiet echo of that gift. The ice may have melted, but it still runs in our veins. The ice began to retreat. Not all at once, not in triumph, but in silence. A long exhale after 100,000 years of breath held tight. Across continents, glaciers melted into rivers. The white deserts of the north turned to plains of green. Mammoths marched north and vanished into history. The air softened. The world woke. For the first time in human memory, the earth was not a prison of frost. It was a garden waiting to be tended. Around 11,700 years ago, a new epoch began, the Holocene. The climate stabilized, seasons returned, rainfall revived the land. It was the end of the last ice age, and the beginning of everything that would follow. But to the survivors, it must have felt strange, almost dangerous. Generations had known only the rhythm of hunger and migration, the discipline of scarcity, the certainty that the cold would always come again. Now, the world was different. The forests returned. Rivers ran deeper. Grasslands shimmered where ice once ruled. The danger was no longer to endure the cold, but to understand abundance. The ice had forged a species of nomads, but warmth would teach them to stay. As the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, more than 120 meters, swallowing the coasts that humans once walked. The dry plains that had connected islands became oceans again. The Sunda Shelf, once a bridge between Vietnam and Borneo, drowned beneath the rising tides. The Bering Land Bridge, which linked Asia to the Americas, disappeared under waves. Entire homelands vanished beneath the sea. But the melting also brought life. Fish-filled rivers, fertile valleys, wetlands thick with reeds and birds. Humanity's stage had changed once more. And, as always, we adapted. For millennia, fire had been our heart, the center of every camp, every story, every life. Now, as the world grew warmer, it became a tool instead of a shield. Ash still marked the ground where we once slept. Stone circles, blackened and cold, remained as fingerprints of survival. But our relationship with the flame began to shift. It no longer symbolized fear. It symbolized creation. The same fire that once fought back the ice, now baked clay into pottery, melted metals, and fired bricks for homes that would outlast generations. The weapon of survival became the spark of civilization. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people who had followed wild grasses for millennia began to notice something extraordinary. Seeds dropped along their paths would sprout where they slept. And in that moment, an idea as powerful as fire was born. That life could be grown. It began humbly. Patches of barley and wheat near the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, in what we now call Mesopotamia. The same story unfolded in China's Yellow River with millet and rice, in Africa with sorghum, and later in the Americas with maize and beans. The ice had demanded movement. The warmth invited roots. Farming was not a discovery. It was a psychological revolution, a decision to trust tomorrow. For the first time, humans stopped wandering. They built walls, stored food, and watched the seasons not as threats but as cycles. The great experiment of civilization had begun. As food became predictable, population grew. Tents of hide became huts of mud and timber. Settlements turned to villages. Villages turned to towns. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, around 11,000 years ago, people carved massive stone pillars into circles, each decorated with animals and abstract symbols. It predates the pyramids by 7,000 years. Their communities gathered not for survival, but for meaning. They hunted together, feasted together, and looked at the stars, wondering if the sky was watching back. It was the world's first temple, proof that imagination, once used to endure the cold, was now building faith. The same brain that had painted on cave walls, now painted on time. Myth became calendar. Story became structure. Seasons became gods. The people who once tracked herds now tracked constellations. Their need to understand survival had transformed into a need to understand the universe. Across the world, similar awakenings unfolded. In the floodplains of Egypt, the river valleys of China, the highlands of the Andes, humanity had spread everywhere, and everywhere the same pattern appeared: cooperation, imagination, and adaptation. The Ice Age had forged us in hardship. The Holocene would test us in prosperity. Inside, our bodies still carried the cold. Genetic adaptations from the ice lingered in our metabolism, our blood chemistry, our instincts. The genes that once stored fat in famine now stored too much in abundance. The stress hormones that once sharpened focus now produced anxiety. The hunger for security turned into a hunger for accumulation. We were no longer shaped by glaciers, but by our memories of them. Every wall, every city, every god was a kind of shelter against the ice, a promise that we would never again be at its mercy. As generations settled, knowledge began to pile up like layers of sediment. The first permanent dwellings became archives. Symbols carved in bone evolved into pictographs, and eventually into language written on clay. At Cataluyuk, one of the earliest cities, people painted murals inside their homes. Bulls, hunters, and geometric shapes. Echoes of cave art reborn on plaster. The impulse that had driven the artists of Lascaux was still there. But now it was ordered, recorded, repeatable. We had learned not just to imagine, but to remember across time. For hundreds of millennia, humans had followed the earth, migrating with seasons, moving where animals lead. Now, they began to command the land. Forests were cleared, fields were divided, animals were tamed. Goats, sheep, dogs, all partnerships born of patience. The wilderness became landscape. And for the first time, humanity stood apart from nature. We were still of the earth, but no longer ruled by it. We had stepped outside the circle of survival and into the spiral of progress. Yet, even as civilization rose, the memory of the cold never vanished. Our myth still carried its shadow. In nearly every culture, stories of a great flood, a long night, a frozen darkness, echo the same ancestral memory. The trauma of climate, the fear of loss, the respect for nature's power. The Ice Age had ended, but it still haunted our stories. We began to build to forget, but also to remember. If one could stand above the world, then watching the last remnants of ice dissolve into mist, it would look like awakening. Small fires across continents, villages glimmering in valleys, smoke curling into skies that no longer froze. Children playing by rivers, dogs sleeping near doorways. Music, laughter, language, life reclaiming its rhythm. The same species that once counted days by hunger, now counted them by harvest. We had conquered the ice not through dominance, but through imagination. And that imagination was about to change the planet again, this time by design. Warmth gave us comfort, and comfort gave us ambition. We built monuments, then kingdoms, then empires. We reached for the stars, and forgot how fragile warmth really is. But every field plowed, every forest cleared, every spark drawn from the ground, reminds us of our beginnings. Because the same fire that saved us from the ice still burns beneath our feet. In engines, in reactors, in hearts. We are the children of climate, and now we have become its makers. Across 300,000 years, from the first flicker of firelight to the glow of modern cities, one thread runs unbroken: our ability to imagine beyond the present. That was the gift of the ice. It forced us to see ahead, to plan, to build, to dream. We still carry that instinct. It is why we map stars, why we build machines, why we tell stories about what comes next. Our survival has always depended on memory, and on imagination strong enough to turn memory into meaning. The Ice Age ended, but its lesson remains. Adaptation is not just biology. It is faith in one another, in tomorrow, in the unseen possibilities of the mind. We are, at our core, a species that remembers the cold and builds warmth against it. We are firekeepers, dreamers, architects of survival. And every generation since the glaciers melted has carried the same silent vow: never again to forget what the ice taught us. That cooperation, imagination, and compassion are the truest tools of survival. The ice did not end our story. It began it. And every breath we take in the warmth of the present is written in the frost of our past. We survived the Ice Age. Now we're surviving time. The ice melted, but time did not stop. Freed from the cold, we began to reshape the earth. To plant, to build, to dream beyond survival. Villages rose where glaciers had fallen. Fire became creation instead of defense. And imagination, once born beside the mammoth fire, turned to faith, art, and civilization. But every wall we built, every god we carved, carried the same question. Now that we have conquered nature, can we survive ourselves? Echoes of Sapiens. If stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe and keep exploring with us.